All right. We're starting a little bit later than normal, so I know it's CE graduation. So parents, if you guys need to step out a little bit early, don't worry, no offense taken. Good morning. Yeah, it's good to be back here again. So we're going to continue our series in the book of John. Last week, Pastor David preached on the feeding of the 5,000, and today we are going to continue on with one of Jesus' most astounding miracles. It's where he defied all the laws of physics and science and gravity, the moment where he came to the disciples in the midst of a terrible storm and he walked on water. Now, this week, we're going to focus mainly on John's telling of the miracle, but we are also going to refer to just details that the Gospel of Mark also includes that aren't in the book of John. And then next week, we're actually going to take a look exclusively at Matthew's account of the miracle, because he includes a secondary miracle that only the book of Matthew includes, where Peter also joins Jesus, albeit momentarily, by walking on water. Okay, so let's take a look at the scripture for today. We are in John 6:16-21. This is the reading of God's word. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed 2 or 3.5 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It is I. Don't be afraid." Then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. This is the reading of God's word. Now, first, let's start with verse 16 by looking at the setting. John tells us that the disciples were in a boat headed towards Capernaum, meaning that they would have to cross the Sea of Galilee to get there. Now, I know it's called a sea, but when you stand at the shore of the Sea of Galilee, it really does appear to be more like an ocean because of its massive size. The Sea of Galilee is about 13 miles long, and it's about 8 miles across at its biggest part. It is about 750 feet below sea level, and it's surrounded actually by a cone of mountains all the way around. But on the southwestern side are canyons that cut through the mountains, and it follows their way from the Mediterranean down to the Sea of Galilee. And now the reason why this is an important detail is that oftentimes the winds from the Mediterranean would actually get channeled through these canyons, and the wind would accelerate as the canyon narrows and exits through the Sea of Galilee, which would often create very choppy and windy sailing conditions for sailors on the sea. Now, also, you have to remember that boats back then, they weren't these big cruisers with nice motors on them and radios you could call in for help. They were little tiny vessels. And, oftentimes the more people that are in them, the lower that the boat would sit on the water. And if you weren't careful, a strong wind could take the boat and overturn it if you were out on the sea. They didn't have life preservers, and it was very easy to drown. And this is where we find the disciples this morning. Jesus isn't quite with them yet. They are getting tossed and turned, and it's a storm, and they look out over the water, and they see Jesus approaching. They get scared, and Jesus responds, "Don't afraid, it is I." Now, one thing to keep in mind is that we know that at least some of these disciples were experienced fishermen. We know for sure at least Peter, Andrew, James, and John were fishermen, right? It's detailed when Jesus first calls them to follow him. If you guys remember, in true dramatic fashion, right, when Jesus calls them, they drop their nets and immediately leave their lives to enter into discipleship with Christ. But scholars actually also think that Philip and Thomas may have worked in the fishing trade, which means that they've been on a boat from their earliest remembrance of life. They know how to deal with these sorts of things. They're well aware that the kinds of storms that come upon the Sea of Galilee, but this was probably a particularly rough storm. And after rowing for, we're told, about 3 or 4 miles, and this happened at 3 o'clock in the morning, right? We're given this added detail from the book of Mark that about the 4th watch, which again, 3 a.m. to 6 a.m., which means it's pitch black dark in the middle of the water. They're out on this boat. The wind's hitting them straight in the face, and they're just trying to get through this terrible storm. And it's in this context that Jesus appears. Jesus comes walking on the sea, coming near the boat, and they were frightened. Right? Mark actually uses the descriptor that they were freaked out, right? And as a result of being freaked out, they actually let out a loud cry together. Now, one of the questions that I had when I was kind of preparing and for the message, when I was doing a close reading was, why do the disciples leave without Jesus? It's kind of weird, right? I mean, Jesus is supposed to be leading them. They're supposed to be following them, and they're all traveling together, but Jesus, he makes the disciples get into the boat. It's a forceful command. Why does Jesus do that? Why didn't he just ask them to get in? Why does he make them get into the boat and go first? Well, according to John, after the feeding of the 5,000, the crowd, they wanted to rally around Jesus and start a rebellion against Rome. Right? You see, every time that Jesus performed a miracle, particularly when there were large crowds like this, the people would begin to press upon him. They would begin to pressure him. They would want to anoint Jesus as their king, and they wanted him to deliver them from the Romans. And on this particular occasion, it seems maybe that the crowd's response was so strong that some scholars believe that the disciples themselves may have gotten swept up in this, right? And Jesus might have seen this, right? Jesus might have seen that they were as excited as the crowd, and they were looking to Jesus with that look in their eye for Jesus to drive the Romans out. So Jesus sends them on ahead without him. And after dismissing the disciples, Jesus dismissed the crowd by himself. Right? In his own way, Jesus puts to rest any sort of spontaneous move to make him king. Now, one detail to also focus on here is that Jesus sends the disciples. He commands them, which means that Jesus knows what's going to happen. He sends them on this journey he has them board this boat, knowing full well that a storm is coming. He sends them into the storm. And sometimes God does the same to us, because oftentimes there's a purpose in the storms that we face in our own lives. It's in the storms that we discover the truth. It's in the trials that we find out what we're really made of, right? What our hearts are made of, what we really care about. Because through our words, you might say, yeah, money's not that important to me. My job's not that important to me. My looks, they're not that important to me. My status, my power, I mean, whatever it is, yeah, it's not that important to me. But what happens when the storm comes? What happens when there's a threat that you may lose your job, you may lose your money, you may lose your looks or your status, which we all will? What happens to you when the storms come? The storms of our lives expose the lie that you're in control, that you can handle the storms on your own. The truth is that we are vastly under-resourced and underprepared. And only in the storms, the merciful storms that God sends us into, do we see these lies. Can we confront these lies and where we see our fears surface? We're not in control. And I know that those of you that have been through storms in your past, right? Storms that you've gotten through, you can testify to God's faithfulness in bringing you through those storms. And you can probably also testify to the type of growth that you went through as a result of the storm. Which means that we shouldn't be startled by the fact that Jesus does send us intentionally into storms in our lives. God will never abandon you to deal with the storms alone, and Jesus never minimizes the storm. What he does instead is maximize himself. He doesn't just simply say, well, don't worry, it's not that bad. It's going to be over pretty soon. We're not that far from land. Instead, what does Jesus say? He says, take heart. It is I. I want you to see who I am. I want you to see me as the I am. That's how you deal with the storms in your life. And the purpose of the storms is to get you to see that he is God and no one else. That's how he helps the apostles deal with the storm, and that's how he'll help you deal with your own storms. Now, when we look at the verses for today, there are three things that we learn about Christ when he walks on water during the storm. Number one, he's powerful. Number two, he is holy. And number three, he is God. So the first thing that we see is that he is powerful. If you look at verse 19, again, when they were 3.5 miles away, they saw Jesus approaching the boat walking on water. Now, the first thing I want to point out here is that Jesus is not simply walking on water. He is walking through a storm. The disciples, they are straining at the oars. They're in trouble, right? Historians think that on the Sea of Galilee, winds could reach 30 to 50 miles per hour easily because of the unique geography of the land. And in a more severe storm, it could go even higher than that. So the disciples, they've been struggling for hours and they can't get to land. It's a severe storm, and they see Jesus approaching this boat walking on water. And John actually deliberately uses a Greek word here that's a little bit surprising to describe Jesus walking. In Greek, there's a number of different words to use for walking, and one of them that he could have chosen just is a normal word for kind of treading on land, right? And I know that in my own imagination, it kind of made more sense to me when I was thinking about this, that Jesus, he'd be kind of slogging through the water, at least a little bit, right? Like kind of like when you walk through thick mud or when you walk through snow, like you really have to lean forward to make progress. But that's not how John describes Jesus here. Rather, the word used is a word that means to amble, or it means to stroll. It's a word that usually means that you stop out on your journey and you get out and you walk around and you do some sightseeing, right? In other words, Jesus, he's chilling, right? He's not labored. He's not worried. He's just taking a stroll through this storm. Now, storms, and especially storms over sea, over water, they can be the most chaotic and destructive powers on earth, right? I mean, there is no more uncontrollable, destructive, chaotic power than a hurricane over the water. Yet, there are two places in the New Testament where Jesus is in the middle of these great storms over water. And the other time that this happens, he's surrounded by terrified sailors, and one time he speaks a word, and the storm instantly goes calm. So first point here, Jesus is powerful. He's casually strolling through a sea storm, and not only does he have absolute power over the wind and the waves, they have no power over him. This is who Jesus is. This is who we worship, not just a merciful God, not just a gracious God, but an omnipotent God who commands the winds and the waves. Amen. Point number 2. The second thing we learn about Jesus is that he is holy. In verse 19, they rowed 3.5 miles, and again, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on water, and they were terrified. But if you look closely, the disciples, they aren't that scared until Jesus shows up. Right? We've already established that the disciples had a number of people who were fishermen on the Sea of Galilee, and the Sea of Galilee was notorious for its storms. So again, in all likelihood, they know what to expect. They've gone through storms before, but it's not until Jesus shows up that they're terrified. Why is this? They're terrified because in that moment, they realize they're in the presence of something different, something holy. When Jesus shows up, he's walking on water. And as he walks in the water, he makes it clear that he's from somewhere else, right? They sense that they're in the presence of the supernatural because they've never seen anything like this before, right? The past 1,000 out of 1,000 times that someone's gone overboard, they've sunk. But here, that person is rising above the waves. Right? And it becomes clear to them that they are in the presence of something transcendent above them. They're in the presence of something from another world, and it's because of that that they react in terror. because that's the natural human response to the supernatural. Now, let me give you an example. I'm not a tall guy by any means. Right? My driver's license says that I'm 5'6". I tell everyone that I'm 5'6", but I'm going to let you in on my shameful secret. I'm actually like 5'5" and like 3/4, right? Maybe like closer to 1/2, but I just round up, right? But I've been below average height my whole life. I'm used to it. I'm used to being one of the shorter guys. It's my lot in life. It's fine. But as a short guy, do you know when I felt the shortest in my life? Like I felt like a little person. Many years ago, I went to a Clipper game. And I'm a Laker fan, just FYI. But I went to a Clipper game. But after the game, you had this chance to meet some of the players. And I had the chance to meet Kenyon Martin. Now, Kenyon Martin plays power forward, and in his prime, the guy leaps out the building. He's a masterful dunker, and he's 6 feet 9 inches tall. Right? Now, look at him, and look like he's leaning over, and I'm still like barely chest high. He's towering over me. Okay, and I know I'm not tall, but standing next to an NBA, like I felt tiny. I said, he looks like a giant, right? And then it was even worse, where as he was leaving, he shook my hand, and his hand like enveloped my hand. I felt like a baby. It was very emasculating, okay? Like physically, it's the smallest I've ever felt in my whole life, okay? Now, again, in my brain, I know I'm short, okay? But being confronted face to face with this massive disparity, seeing another human being that's like that much taller than me, it was such a shocking reminder of how short that I am. And here's the thing, yes, Kenyon Martin, he's an NBA player, he's tall, but he's not even like the tallest player in the NBA, right? Like we all know the actor, The Rock, Dwayne Johnson. Now in your mind, you probably think, well, Dwayne Johnson, he's huge, he's like ripped, he's jacked, right? I mean, in all the movies, he looks massive. He's actually like 6'3", right? But look at how small The Rock looks compared to Charles Barkley and Shaq. Whoa. Like he looks tiny, right? So again, there are literally tens of thousands of people that are as tall or taller than Kenyon Martin in the world. So it's not even like I came face to face with like the tallest person. It was just like an above average NBA player. And this doesn't even come close with the face-to-face encounter with God. Right? It's not at all like what happened to Moses in Exodus when he meets God. When Moses met God in the burning bush, God has to tell Moses, man, you better take off those flip-flops because you're standing on holy ground right now. Right? And God checks Moses and says, you better recognize where you are right now and you better start acting right. Right? God reveals himself to Moses, and once Moses fully grasps the enormity of the situation, Moses has to hide. He's terrified because the holiness of God is revealed to him in that moment. He's come face to face with the Almighty. He's just encountered the true and living God, and it terrifies him. And just as the holiness of God is revealed to Moses in the fury of the fire, the holiness of Jesus is revealed to the disciples in the fury of the water. And again, it's not. Now, the third truth that's revealed about Jesus, not only is he powerful, not only is he holy, but he is, in fact, the true and living God. Right? If we move down to verse 20, it says, he says to them, it is I. Now, it's already pretty amazing to see Jesus strolling through the storm, but what he actually says to the disciples in this moment is even more shocking than what he does. Jesus says, it is I. Now, the poor translators of the Bible, they must have had a difficult time with this verse, right? There's an awful lot of confusing things that Jesus says when you try and translate things word for word that would make readers scratch their heads. Because you see, when a person says, I am in Greek, you can usually do it in one of two ways. You can say ego, which is where we get the word ego from, which means I am, Or someone can say the word ami, which is another form of the verb to be, which means I am. But here we find a strange construction in the Gospel of John. Jesus combines ego and ami, and he uses the intensified form of this verb, and he says ego ami. And if we translate that literally, Jesus says, I am, I am. Now what's going on here? Is Jesus stuttering? Right? Does he have some sort of speech impediment? Absolutely not. He's using an expression that the New Testament Greeks uses to translate the ineffable name of God. That again is a callback to Moses. When Jesus Christ says, I am, he's giving the divine name as his name. Right? This is what God says to Moses in the burning bush in Exodus 3, when he was trying to open up to Moses the deepest secret of his identity. When God gives his name that looks into his deity and his godness, he says to Moses, I am. Why is that? When God says I am, first it means I was doesn't apply to me because I have no beginning. I will be doesn't apply to me because I'm never going to change, right? You can never say that God will be something because will be means that God's going to change. I'm going to be something other than what I am now, which doesn't apply to God. When God says I am, he's not only saying I have no beginning and no end, he's also saying I'm the transcendent God. I created the world, I existed before the world, and I'm the one who stays sustaining everything. I'm the one holding everything together. I'm the cause for all existence. I don't just exist because of something, but rather everything exists because of me. And this is who Jesus says he is. This is the reason why this supplements an earlier point so importantly. Why can Jesus just take a stroll through the storm? Why isn't Jesus rolling up his sleeves to calm the storm? Why isn't he slogging through the storm with great effort? Why is he just chilling? Here's why. He's not just a source of great power. He's the source of all power. All the power in the world is just on loan from him. Everything that has being, everything that has power, everything that has existence is dependent on Jesus, on God at this very second. It's a claim of not just, I'm powerful, let me into your life and I'll help you, but I am the ultimate Lord. This is not just a being who's channeling power from God. This is God himself, which would have been a shocking claim. Right? And that leads to my next point, that when after Jesus says, I am, his statement, his command, do not be afraid, is revolutionary. Right? Because again, you see, normally when we experience fear, when we are afraid, fear can be cast out in two ways. First, because of the presence of power and authority, or second, fear can be cast out because the presence of relationship. Right? And usually it's one of these two that helps to reduce our fears. So let's say that you're on an airplane, or that I'm on an airplane and there's some sort of medical emergency, right? The pilot says, is there a doctor on board? And let's say I raised my hand. I said, don't worry, it's okay. I got this. Said, thank goodness. Are you a doctor, sir? I said, no. Are you a nurse? No. But hear me out. I watch a lot of TV shows. I've watched Scrubs and ER, seasons 1 and 2 of The Pitt. And when I was younger, I even watched some Doogie Howser. So don't worry. Help has arrived. I got this. Right? No one would care. They'd get mad at me for wasting their time, right? Putting this person's life at risk. I have zero claim of power and authority in that situation. I've got no control. I've got nothing to actually help or contribute to this situation. But in Psalm 29, we read about God. The God of glory thunders. The voice of the Lord strikes with flashes of lightning. The voice of the Lord twists the oaks and strips the forest bare. The Lord sits enthroned above the flood. He's enthroned as king forever. And when Jesus says, I'm that God, when you hear that thunder, that power is just on loan from me, right? Nothing in nature even has power except on power that comes from me. So what is a hurricane to God? It's just a dirty drop of water. Right? God laughs in the face of natural disasters. God has power over all destruction, over all death, over all disorder. Right? But scenario 2, okay? Again, because cast out fear through power or cast out fear through relationship. If my daughter has a nightmare and she wakes up crying and scared, right? I'm going to run in there and I'm going to pick her up and I'm going to pat her back. I'm going to say, shh, you don't have to be afraid. All right, Dad's here. Don't worry, Dad's here. Don't be afraid. Dad's here. And in this situation, it would actually help comfort my daughter, right? It would actually help to get rid of her fears. And it's not because I necessarily have power, right? I'm not like a black belt. I'm not like some secret MMA cage fighter like Hoban. But it's because of my relationship with my daughter, right? My kids know that I'll do everything in my power to protect them, right? They know that Dad's going to do whatever it takes to keep them safe. It's not my power that casts out fear. It's relationship that casts out fear in that moment. And here is the good news, church. In Jesus, we get the best of both worlds. Because you see, before Jesus, all throughout the Old Testament, when a person is in the direct presence of a holy and powerful God, it means death. Right? God is simply too holy to behold without some sort of barrier to shield themselves. Right? And we see this time after time again. When Moses wants to see God's glory, God says, "You cannot see my face, for no one may see me and live." So to shield Moses, God places him in the cleft of a rock and covered with his hand as his glory passed by. When the prophet Elijah was fleeing from death threats from Queen Jezebel and hid in a cave, the Lord passed by him in a gentle whisper. And Elijah recognized the divine presence, and out of overwhelming understanding that, again, no one can see God's face and live, he wraps his face in a cloak before stepping out to speak with God. When the Ark of the Covenant was being transported and the oxen pulling the cart stumbled, causing the ark to tilt, a man named Uzzah reached out to steady the ark to stop him from falling, and he died instantly for touching the holy object, for being an unclean man. When the prophet Isaiah saw a vision of God on the throne and the angels chanting, "Holy, holy, holy," his immediate response was terror. He says, "Woe to me, I am ruined," and he feels completely undone about his wickedness when he's standing exposed before the absolute holiness of God. Time and time again, we see that when God shows up in power, the overwhelming lesson is you should be trembling in fear. This is a holy, holy God. He does not mess around. So on the one hand, his presence casts out fear because of his authority. But it also, at this time, creates fear because of his holiness. But when Jesus descends from heaven to be born as a man, to walk among us, to live the life we should have lived, to die the death we should have died, to be our intercessor, to be our mediator, to be our substitute, where God's presence once brought fear, the presence of Christ now brings comfort and casts out fear. Because of Jesus, we don't need a high priest, because he is our high priest. We can go directly to God. We don't have to fear the presence of God anymore. We don't need a heavy veiled curtain to separate us from the holiness of God, because now the Spirit of God isn't limited to a tabernacle. It's dwelling inside each and every believer. And finally, verse 21 tells us that what the apostles did next was the smartest thing that they could have done. They willingly received him into the boat. And this morning, some of you still need to do that. Whatever boat you're in, whatever trial you're going through, your experience, your life, you're just floating on the sea of life, and the storms come. And for a lot of us this morning, when we find ourselves in the middle of the storm, our default approach to getting out of the storm, right, when the wind is biting and the waves are getting choppy, we think we can get out by rowing harder. If it's getting hard, I just need to work harder, right? My plans aren't coming together, but the job's not done yet, so I just need to work harder. I need to make it happen, right? Suck it up, Buttercup. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. I know my plate's full. I know that my bandwidth is already maxed out, but I just have to dig a little bit deeper, just push a little bit harder, endure for a little bit longer, and keep pushing against this headwind. And just like the disciples were trying to do before Jesus shows up, we are toiling. We are straining at the oars, and you're making progress painfully. Because the problem is that we're doing it on our own strength. That's right. And that's when we get in trouble. And I don't know which one of you guys need to hear this reminder this morning, because I know that I need to be reminded all the time. Brothers and sisters, when God calls you to go somewhere, when God calls you to do something for the purpose of his glory, he never intends you to carry that weight by yourself. You are not meant to toil alone, church. So I would invite you to let Jesus into your boat. Let him be the Lord of the storm, and let him be the Lord of your life. Not just because he's powerful, not just because he's the true and living God, but more importantly, because he loves you. And perfect love is what casts out fear. Allow Jesus to be the God of your storms. Right? The reason why he can save us from these storms, the reason why he's eventually going to end all storms, the reason why he's going to bring a new heaven and a new earth where there's no more suffering, no more death, where there's no more tears, he's going to save us from the storms because he was drowned in the ultimate storm. He bowed his head into the storm of divine justice and wrath because of our sin, so that we could have peace with God and be reconciled. And if you understand that Christ did that for you, if you understand that he took the ultimate storm, do you think he's going to abandon you in the storm that you're in right now? I want to invite the worship team back up as we meditate on the word today. If you could bow your heads with me.